Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Nancy, for having invited me, and the board for inviting me, and the people working on the snacks to be working on our snacks that will be reminiscent of what was available, what kind of foods would have been eaten in Switzerland if you were living 5,000 years ago on one of the many platform villages on the lakes in the Alpine foothills. When Nancy contacted me and said, would you like to give a talk? I thought, oh yeah, great. I've been working on bread for 25 years, essentially every day, 10 hours a day, not exaggerating. But the last couple years, I've been working on wild mushrooms and the edibility assessment in wild mushrooms in field guides. So I thought, well, I need to get back to bread. I'm just about done with this mushroom thing. I have a talk. It's ready to go. I gave it in my online culinary history talks earlier in the year. And, I know that's what you're supposed to do. You just pick up a talk, you've got the slides, you give it. But when I picked up the slides and just started asking a couple more questions, I discovered that what I wanted to tell you was utter nonsense, completely. Would have been bullshit, to put it bluntly. So, we are still focused on an excavation of a Neolithic, late Neolithic, Chalcolithic, meaning there was copper in the area, though probably not in this village, time period, and two bread-like objects to maintain anthropological distance for the moment. And I've completely rethought it and realized that it really is the key to the primary question in bread history, which is, why is there only wheat? Why is the largest crop in the world wheat? Why is 20% of world calories coming from wheat? Why not barley? Why not rye? Why wheat? I realized that through really looking at this village, we can begin to address some really larger questions that explain historical structures and systems. Now, I haven't given this talk before, so I'm sure I have way more slides than we have time for. I am watching the clock here, and if necessary, I'll just jump to the end and to the questions. Bread is an invention, like a chair, a car, a shoe, like my really, really beautiful I love it iPhone. not the broken back. There's everything about bread is driven by culture. There is no bread tree. No farmer ever harvested a tuber. No farmer ever harvested anything that yielded bread. What they harvest yields grain. And that grain we can't eat. We can't live on it. We can't live. We're not rodents. We're not birds. We don't have the teeth. We don't have the stomachs. So for us to eat that grain, we have to process it. Every decision, which grain, how processed, how baked. Do you like them long and flat like a lavash? Do you like them dense like a bagel? Do you like them open crumbed like a ciabatta? All of that is under control of culture. Now, us animals, we are apes. And apes are hierarchical creatures. And there's no creature more hierarchical in the ape group than humans. And so we're all certain when we look up in the stars, we're going to find written the recipe for the best bread in the world, the one bread that really, really, really is important. And then if you're super rich or want to be, or in a high social status, or want to be, this is the bread you want to put on your table for an important meal. And that bread is written in our hearts. It's not in the stars. You might find Cassiopeia, if that's your culture, for star wisdom, but you will not find the recipe for the best bread. That is in our hearts. A long, long time ago, our ancestors made a choice. Now, the first two bread grains, and these bread grains are large seeded grasses that have gluten. Gerald Diamond in Guns, Germs, and Steel explained how very lucky the people were in the Levant to live where they had these big seeded grasses with gluten that doesn't exist anyplace else. Obviously, rice is a big seeded grass, millet, but there's something really special about the gluten grains. And those were the two options. Rye was a weed. Rye was domesticated from the barley and wheat fields thousands of years into domestication, and rye still exhibits weediness. It is the least domesticated of these grains. Now, what's really amazing and fantastic and hard to believe and absolutely incredible is that barley will grow any place that wheat grows, and some places that it won't. Rye, once we got it, it grows every place wheat grows in temperate continental climates. It can't grow near the equator. So there's some places it doesn't grow, but it's also, if you planted rye where in Kansas and Ukraine and Australia, you would get some really strong crops. But what you see here in this table, can you read the table? Can we turn this light off? That's better. So what this shows you is that the largest crop in the world by acreage is wheat, and most of that goes to human consumption. That, for all practical purposes, there are no barley fields for human consumption. That's getting worse and worse. I think the light just came up. There are no rye fields for human consumption on a statistical basis. It's all wheat. There's 100 times more wheat fields grown for human consumption than barley, 100 times more and 50 times more than rye. Because in Northern Europe, there actually are a couple cultures that are still focused on their rye. But what I just want to emphasize is our ancestors made a choice, and they made that choice in the Epi-Paleolithic. The Epi-Paleolithic, that's before I think it's unfortunately named Neolithic New Stone Age, which really is the age of agriculture. Now, William Faulkner, in a book, Requiem for a Nun, said the past is never dead. It's not even past. And with that preamble, I want to pass out some grain. So I need volunteers. I've got 3 sections here. So could people come up? So just pick a 3, 1 for each group. 1, 2, okay? No. Well, here's some here. Just one. Take 1.
Oh, I see. These are identical.
Yeah, those are identical. Okay. And then maybe you could start on this side group. We need all 3. I'll tell you what you got. So you have, where's the probe? What do I see? You need this.
Yeah.
You need this. You need these. Okay. So 27,000 years ago, which is a little bit before the glacial maximum, wheat and barley began to display a mutation of brittle 1 and brittle 2. And these mutations made it possible for the seed to stick to the stalk. So like a dandelion, grain is wind dispersed. You blow, it goes away. But beginning back then, there got to be a mutation that would stick. Now, sticking is very, very bad for the wild population, because if the grain sticks to the stalk, then it will not get dispersed by the wind, it will not get dispersed by birds, it will not get dispersed by rodents, and it will, sadly for it, die out. But we know that 23,000 years ago, at the glacial maximum, in a little village we call Ohalo 2, it's 5 little huts on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, that people were making bread. There's a grindstone, there's thousands of seeds around the grindstone, and we can see evidence that they were replanting seeds. And we know that from the kinds of weeds that were growing, like darnel, weeds that opportunistically grow with the grain fields. And what's amazing about the grouping of seeds, there's 36% of those seeds have this characteristic of the stalk not breaking off. So, are these seeds distributed? Does everyone have some seeds in your hand?
Shall we just?
Yeah, distributed. I'm sorry. I'm trying to talk to covering your work. Everyone needs one of each.
You need a little
What?
bit.
I'm going to describe them. So just get a pinch of each seed in your hand.
Okay.
1, 2. There's enough there. You can probably have 2 or 3 each. Okay. And what you have there is the reddish, shiny reddish seed that just looks like a seed. Most of you will be familiar. That's wheat, and that's spring. That's hard winter wheat. That's the main kind of wheat we grow in the United States. Hard winter wheat. Then you have a white piece, a white grain, and you can see that it's white. And if you look carefully, you can see it's been abraded. That's barley, and it's called pearled barley. It's been put in the machine to get the bran coat off. And then you've got another one, and that is barley that still has the bran coat. Okay? Now, there were probably multiple attempts, multiple events where groups, like at Ohalo 2 at the time of the glacial maximum, started replanting grains that they harvested. And remember that they're harvesting with magnificent scythes. They're carved. If you ever go to the Museum of Israel in Jerusalem, you will see these Natufian, which was a late Paleolithic group that morphed into the Neolithic, the first farmers. Just gorgeous scythes with sharp blades. And we can see from those, the wear on those blades, that those were used to harvest barley and wheat that was greenish, not fully ripened. Anyway, sometime around 10,000 years ago, people started not just planting them as they had in the Halo 2, and then moving back to being pure hunters and gatherers, but they started doing this year after year after year, and slowly by slowly, and then perhaps the way you go bankrupt suddenly all at once, they found themselves to be trapped. They were trapped by domestication. So what had happened was that they made it so that all of the grain stuck, 100% of them stuck. So now you could harvest, you get everything back, you could process those grains, and you could make bread with 100% of what you harvested. And I would like to make clear and emphasize and make clear and emphasize and say again and make clear and emphasize that bread is a female technology. Up to this point, it's unlikely that men had much to do with making bread at all. As hunter-gatherers, women will have gathered the grain, and we know that they processed the grain in their homes, and we've got grindstones, you've got all of the mod cons. They also were the weavers, and they had sieves, and we know from all the early breads were made with wheat that have survived, and all those had been sifted mostly to white, where over half of the starch grades are under 300 microns. So what is notable about those seeds is that the wheat is free threshing. That means you grow it, you then can bang it with a flail, the seeds fly out, you collect the seeds, and you're off and running. But the barley's not. The barley at my corner store, it's not free threshing. That's why whenever you buy barley, if you want to make a bread that doesn't have a lot of bran in it, and you're grinding your own, you have to buy pearled barley or put barley in the soup. It's had another mechanical process. Why is that? Why is that? Now the DNA from 27,000 years ago with those first mutations that let the grain stick, and then all the mutations that caused these to be domesticated crops that won't grow in nature, those occurred, as I said, 10,000, 11,000 years ago, so like 9,000, 8,000 BCE. And what's remarkable is nobody bothered to make the investment, the cultural investment in making the barley free threshing. It's 2025. It's 2025. Except there's two exceptions. There's two exceptions. Tibet and Ethiopia. There are areas in Tibet and in Ethiopia where you cannot grow wheat. They rely on barley. We're going to talk about this a little bit later. But those of you familiar with Mary Douglas' Purity and Danger, and just the way that anthropologists think about food. In Ethiopia and in Tibet, the normative category bread was barley. And so they said, we're not going to mess around with this husk. We want it to be free threshing. So they made it free threshing. What you have here is 10,000 years of Western Asia's lack of respect for barley as a food bread. And we're going to be seeing that in the village that we're going to be talking about. There's a concept that I've been thinking about of metabolic metaphysics. Metabolic metaphysics. Now, the DNA in that bread, in those grains you have there, we can trace the entire course back 27,000 years to when the first brittle rachis mutation occurred. And this grain comes from the southern Levant. This grain went through Ohalo II, went through this part of the Levant. Because barley, and the other side, the barley more easterly, it picked up the BTR2 gene for causing that rachis not to break off. So we know that this population absolutely comes from a certain portion of Levant, and you're holding it in your hand. Now, when you eat bread, and I just brought a loaf from home. When you eat this, and you chew. Now, in Western philosophy, this is a thing. It exists. It's an object. And you have the Aristotelian idea of things that just are, that things that are fixed, that don't change in nature. And then we also have, so this is the idea of being. We also in Western philosophy have the idea of becoming. And what we don't really have exactly is this idea of retaining identity through consumption. You eat it, it's bread. Well, now is it still bread? Probably you could still say bread. The doctors would find that. It's eventually going to dissolve into my body, and then some of it is going to be excreted. If I was in this village in Switzerland that we're going to be talking about, I would be excreting it, and some of that would probably get in the fields and then back into the plants, and we would have this auroribus, the tail, the snake that eats its tail situation. So the question is, are these ancient breads old breads, or do they live continuously, which we see through the DNA, because the DNA stays the same. So these are the two breads that we're going to be talking about. The one on the left right, so that's the These are the breads we're going to be talking about. Two late Neolithic or Chalcolithic bread-like objects. And we know it's Chalcolithic. You guys all know Otzi. We're going to see his picture really soon. Otzi was murdered about 200 miles away from this village, and he had objects from the Horton culture, which is this culture, but he had a copper axe. So, sticking with anthropology, the language of archaeology, we're going to call them bread-like objects. The one on the left is barley. It's coarse flour, and you will see it's asymmetrical. Everything about it is asymmetrical. It's very poorly made, badly crafted. It's just a lump of dough. The one on the right, though, is made of wheat. It's been sifted towards white. Notice the very nice, clean central circle. And, quite remarkably, it has celery seeds in it. This is the first bread that's been excavated that had an aromatic seed, and those seeds, as we're going to see, came from Italy, probably on the salt trade. To make it real, this was an emergency excavation, and when you go to Zurich the next time, and some of you have a next time, then go to the parking lot at the Zurich Opera. It's obviously down by the lake, and then go in, and it's going to be signed. You go down to the bottom floor, and you'll see a little exposition of the excavation. So this is a 19th century print, and what you see is these poles. These villages lasted about 8 to 15 years, and then they were rebuilt. So each one is a purpose-built village, and they're common primarily to Switzerland, but also to Germany, Italy, and France. And in fact, the models seem to have come from Italy around 6000 BC, and we know this because the same crops being grown in Switzerland suddenly appeared in Switzerland that really had been in Italy. And this is what Otzi looks like, except I'm sorry. You can never say you're sorry enough for the racial bias in Western science, in Eurocentric science, because actually he didn't have that sterling white skin there. He was darker complexioned, more like a Sardinian North African today. And we know that from DNA. DNA really is the secret to the history of bread. It's a secret to rebuilding the past. And for all these huge numbers of years, we had these villages on stilts. The ground was soggier. So this is what you can imagine, more or less. This is a recreation from the 60s. It's probably slightly different now. But still, that's the concept. But what you really are going to be blown away by, yesterday I went to Lakma with my partner Carol, and we're driving, we're Ubering down Wilshire, or one of the streets, and there's gated communities. We see off the side streets that there's communities with these gate posts. And what's absolutely astonishing is this village, which appears suddenly all at once. Remember, they're replaced every 8 to 15 years. It had big houses and little houses. The big houses in Area A were 5 times larger than the houses in Area B. They had fancier things in them. And quite astonishingly, they liked antiques. They had modern, recently made pottery, but in the style of a couple hundred years ago. I eat on Georgian silver. My dining room table is from 1800. It's a pearwood table from France. I'm an affluent person. I live with the past around me. So did they. And the A houses had a whole separate entrance. It's really fabulous. And the A houses had these beautiful axes, these jadeite axes. Those of you who've been to Taipei, or are going to go to Taipei when you go to the Palace Museum, one of the most impressive objects is a jade Neolithic axe that had been collected actually by royal families in China for thousands of years. And I was very surprised to find that same stone and that same level of perfection. It takes something like 1,000 hours to make an axe acts like that. And they weren't used. They're ceremonial. They're just showing, I'm really rich. I've got this fancy thing. Here is a copper axe, and as I said, we didn't have it in the village itself, but Otzi had one, and I just want you to be focused on the quality of the craft. I need to speed up. The seeds came from Italy with the salt trade, and I find that absolutely delicious because Stephen Switzer, who was an agricultural writer in England in the early 18th century, writes about rich people, rich men, not people, not women, but rich men. We would order our fancy outfits from the tailor in Milano, just like we do today if you were rich enough to do that kind of thing. But you'd also order your vegetable seeds. So sprouting broccoli, and actually the red sprouting broccoli, which if you go to London during sprouting broccoli season, fantastically, they still, primary kind is colored red. That came from Italy with the thread dealers. This came with the salt. And it's not a very long walk. I have two friends that have walked the Pacific Crest Trail, which is Mexico to the Oregon border. It doesn't take very long, and miraculously, of course, they stored flour in caves, in the mountain passes, so that you could get through. We have a misapprehension that people were kind of stuck in some little village and never got nowhere, and that's not true. We've been on the move. We've been immigrating. We've been emigrating since time immemorial. That's what humans do. That's how we got out of Africa in the first place. And again, the grains themselves that they were growing came from villages in Switzerland. So I want us to think anthropologically. How do we order the information? So for 15,000 years, we see that bread meant wheat. And here, Mary Douglas, I would like to read the entire passage from Deciphering a Meal, 1972. If food is treated as a code, the messages it encodes will be found in the pattern of social relations being expressed. The message is about different degrees of hierarchy, inclusion, and exclusion, boundaries and transactions across the boundaries. Like sex, the taking of food has a social component as well as a biological one. Food categories, therefore, encode social events. So in my work on this bread, history, and also on this village, I'm thinking three ways. One is this longue durée, which I'm going to talk about more, the idea that there's patterns in history that don't change. One is micro-history, where we just get really focused down, how do they make the flour in that village at this time, and anthropologically. So wheat is wasteful, therefore wheat has status. Those of you who've read or heard, Veblen, Thurston Veblen, 1900 theory of the leisure class, where he says, you buy that bonnet for $7.50, it keeps the sun off your face, so you can keep that beautiful pale female complexion, but the 50-cent bonnet would do just as well. The difference between the 50 cents and the $7.50, that is conspicuous consumption. I'm rich, I can afford to throw my money away for no reason whatsoever, but to tell you that I am richer than you are. So the thing about wheat is it requires the best land. It can only grow on really good land. So there's a conspicuous allocation of scarce resources. Fertilizer. Wheat has to be fertilized. And remarkably, it uses fertilizer more inefficiently than barley. Barley uses half the fertilizer for the same effect. So you've got a conspicuous expenditure of labor, which is manuring. The barley you don't have to manure at all. And the barley can go on the poor land, which is where it was always put. And then the milling. Now I want you maybe to pick up, if you still have those seeds somewhere, you've got the little red wheat one. sort of put that between, your incisor and sort of feel how hard that is on your teeth, and you can do the same with that pearled barley. So the women are spending hours a day kneeling, grinding this grain, becoming injured, so that every step they make in life is painful. And if they used barley, they would have saved at least half the time, and probably more, and they would have had less injury. Now, the women, I said it's a women's project, and I think you should think of the women as a vertically integrated manufacturing system. Even now, last time I was in Rajasthan, the women were the ones who were harvesting the wheat. The men now do the heavy work of breaking the land, now that we break the land. But the women, they were harvesting it, they're grinding it, they're making the bread, and they're serving it. And I think their family just likes wheat better. In any case, no pain, no gain in the Calvinistic way of looking at things. The effort, the pain they put into it, they're showing love for their family, and are drivers, I think, culturally, for that choice. In any case, wheat is bad for women's bodies for thousands and thousands of years, and it has a lower return per unit input. In fact, if you grow barley on good land with manure, it can outperform wheat in terms of yield per acre. And there's many, many studies on female skeletons from the period. The reason we know that women are the bakers is sexual dimorphism. Your female toes are on average smaller than my male toe, and Charles over here, his male toe. And so you can see that the smaller toes, the smaller adult toes are associated with the problems with the body. Wheat is luxury. Wheat is luxury. And there's this beautiful image that used to be in the Egyptian Museum on Tahrir Square, not sure which museum it's in now. But wheat uses the best land, requires twice the fertilizer, physically harder to mill. What's there not to love about that? And what's important too is that wheat, well, I guess I'm getting to a slide with the genetics. But I'll just say quickly, wheat is they all have gluten, rye, barley, and wheat. But the wheat in gluten is more extensible, means you can stretch it more, and it's more elastic. It bounces back, as everybody here who's made bread knows. You're kneading, if you work it too much, you just let it rest, and in 10 minutes or so you can work it again. But we can assume that the people in the A part of the village, in those big houses, they're the ones with the best land growing the wheat. So we have here in English, though, we wouldn't call it a barley bread, we call it a barley cake. And this gets us back also to Mary Douglas' ideas about categories. There'll be a primary category, the principal category, the normative category. Now, in Indo-European languages, this is not the same in Arabic, and maybe during the question and answer, Charles could talk to us about Arabic. But in Indo-European languages, what bread always means wheat. And you have to say, in the Indo-European language we speak, we say barley bread, rye bread, oat bread, rice bread, non-gluten flour bread, right? So it's telling you it's not the central concept. When the Spanish got to Mexico, they saw tortillas. And some of them noted the color. Like some people were eating red tortillas. When I work that out, that'll be a subject for a different talk, the significance of maize color in American corn products. They recognized that as their bread. Columbus recognized breads made with cassava. They called it yuca, which is manihot esculenta, which in many forms is deadly, deadly, deadly poisonous. Hydrogen cyanide that was used to murder the Jews in Auschwitz is in that. You have to detoxify it for a couple of days to make it a staple food, which is what people still do. I lost the thread. So, anyone think of what the thread? Oh yes, right. So, and they called and they recognized this as bread, and they would say it's bread. In fact, there's a most horrific passage I found in a book by Sir Walter Raleigh. This is around 1500. He is about 1600. He is talking about just if you meet a person, you capture them, you enslave them. They just went in there and they felt it was their right to enslave anybody that they saw. You see them, take them. And they referenced bread. It was just so shocking to be word searching on bread and yucca and then find these intertwined with the enslavement of the local population. It's different in Arabic, some other cultures, but culturally you're going to find that in Egypt, where the meaning of bread is aif, meaning life, very, very beautiful, coming from Egyptian derivation, Egyptian meaning, that they're still making it out of wheat. So in some cases you're seeing the vote for wheat being normative in the cropland. And what you see here is I want to focus on that center circle. Now this we think of, it's such a hell of a long time ago. It's 5,000 years ago. This is, of course, the time of the first dynasty in Egypt is just beginning. You've got, of course, Uruk, Mesopotamia. Harappa is just on the edge of flourishing. The world is coming alive. People are moving around. And there you have a purposeful hole in the middle. And what you see in the upper right is this beautiful painting, a little bread I love in this painting at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, called The Marriage Feast of Cana. And it is obviously white bread, I think brushed with egg to make it even more beautiful to endure. There's a hole in the middle. You see below that on the right is a fresco from, I don't remember if it's from Herculaneum, 1st century. You can see it's segmented. You can see the depression in the middle. The bread on the bottom right, that's an Egyptian bread, one that was being made very, very, very fast. You stuck a post in it, bam, 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 and you moved on. They would make even 1 million breads for a month-long festival. So they were into production. The next two are more images from Egypt. And then on the far left, the dark bread that was from one of the ovens from Herculaneum or Pompeii. Again, you see the depression in the middle. And then you see an array of images of sun symbols. So I think it is safe to say, I'm going to put my neck out, that this symbol, this purposeful stamp in the middle, had symbolic meaning, most likely related to the sun. It would be stupid to say it's a disk, it looks like the sun. That's stupid, because that's physically the easiest way to make it. But I don't think it's stupid to say that when you see it stamped. Did they have anybody there go to Egypt? I don't know. But you know, it's zeitgeist. It's zeitgeist. And even without the internet, people in the regions, they kind of knew what each other were doing. They kind of knew. Now, as I said, we can't be certain. This picture on the left is just so beautiful. It's in a very small tomb in the workers' tombs in the workers' village in Luxor. It's not one, if you, I've spent maybe 6 weeks in Luxor just taking pictures of the breads, and I found this one. And I just love it, the woman. She's in the tree and showing this bread, sort of in a tree of life with this symbol in the middle. And we have the palette of Namor. Those of you who've been to Egypt certainly saw this because it's at the entrance, or was at the entrance to the exhibitions in the museum when it was on Tahrir Square, when all of the collections were there. And what's notable about it in cultural history terms is that these images stayed pretty much the same. The iconography in Egypt did not change very much for 3,000 years. So that's that kind of a context. The barley on the left. So one thing we get from these archaeobotanical studies are the very precise nature of the flower. So you can recreate this. You just have to sift to get a distribution that you see in the bottom left for the barley. And what he's doing is counting. So the number, the up-down axis is telling you how many particles, particle counts, and then going along the bottom axis is the number of microns. And what you can see from it is it's a pretty coarse bread. For the white bread, what you can see is that there's big peaks, and they are 300 microns or less. And 300 microns defines white flour. And then most of it, beyond that, there's a lot of suji. If you go to Indian stores, you can see, you can buy suji. And that's cream of wheat. It's the granular, the British call it semolina. It's the granular part of the aleuron. Now this one on the left is a very big challenge because it is not symmetrical. Now there's no way that it was made by accident. I mean, unless there's a 2-year-old who's playing with bread. But, Mary Douglas, wonderful, anthropologist. And when something is purposefully made to be different, it's saying something about itself. Now, only 4%, I think it's actually the next slide, so maybe I'll talk about this in the next slide. So I wanted to emphasize here is, we know it's white flour, biased towards wheat, and that one on the right has the celery seeds. You can recreate it at home. It's not going to be that different from the pita breads that are being served for the snack today. So we know from the archaeobotanical array at this Park House excavation that 4% of the calories came from barley. Only 4%. It was not a staple food. And it also was not manured. We can guess that. We don't know that. They did not do an isotopic analysis. But we do know, going back 1,000 years, more than 1,000 years before this, by doing isotopic analyses of the grains, that the wheat was very likely to have been manured. So you've got this extra care on the wheat. Now today, so at that time we had 4% barley, 42% calories coming from wheat. Today, in Egypt, I'm saying 35 to 30%. It's 35 to 40% of the calories in Egypt come from bread. And that's the whole population of 100 million. Wealthy people will be a lot less. And worldwide, it's 20%. Quite shocking. 20% of human calories is derived from wheat. Now, that includes Krispy Kreme. It does. And it includes couscous. And it includes pasta. But it's from wheat. It's from wheat. Because you can make those things with barley also. Couscous can be made with barley. And flatbreads can also be made with barley. It doesn't have to be wheat. It doesn't have to be wheat. So this is one of these sort of long durée patterns that have existed forever. And I'm coming to the close where I'm going to want to talk really about the long durée. So there's an excavation in Israel where they found barley grains in a cave. They run the DNA analysis, and those absolutely gifted archaeobotanists had the presence of mind to ask the question, what would the DNA look like in the barley being grown by the Palestinian farmers right here, still at the base of Masada? And what they found was shocker, shocker, shocker. It was the same. I mean, obviously there's some little drift. It's been 6,000 years, but it's the same. And shocker, 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 it's the same as being grown in Egypt, the former colonial power. The first peace treaty was between the Hittites and the Egyptians. A replica is in the lobby of the United Nations. They fought wars right there. They took the barley home. It's still being grown. If, and you know, it's a highly likely yes, if this land race from Park House is still being grown in Switzerland, very likely yes, because the Swiss, they preserve that kind of thing. You're going to find that the same bread. And so I want you to be thinking, oh wait, we'll do this. Oh no, wait, we lost a whole bunch. 1 second. Sorry. I wanted to read to you, well, we'll just have to wing it. Many of you familiar with, do I have it in here? Maybe I do. Maybe I don't. Well, you're not going to get the beautiful of Fernand Braudel's prose. But Braudel wrote in the 1960s. I see many of us here of a certain age. So you probably, those of you who looked at history, bought, and at least bought or took from the library, his works on Mediterranean culture. And Braudel, we still have big influence from Marxism. And Marx was an historian who looked at big systems. He said, look, history is about social relations. You've got, you have, slaves in Rome. You've got slaves, in the southern United States. It's the same relations. I work for you, you pay me pittance, and you live in a nice big house and have a mega yacht. While I pack stuffed packages in your warehouse. So that's the concept. Let's look at deep structures and then ask questions from there. Braudel said, let's look for deep structures, because he said the deep structures create an infrastructure. And I'm sorry that slide didn't show up, because it's a beautiful slide. I worked on it. An infrastructure. Now here I have a bread that I made the other day. And I told you, I want you to be thinking of bread as a process, or maybe I told you I'm going to be talking about that. And this is going to be the closing of the talk and then questions. I don't want you to think of this as a bread, as a noun. I want you to think of it more as a verb, or a philosophical idea, sort of this metabolic metaphysics. And I want you to think of the process the grain has been growing for 27,000 years, 27,000 cycles of harvest planting. For 17,000 of those years, it was mostly a natural harvest planting. Whether many people did the Ohelo 2 model, we don't know. We haven't found those settlements. And Ohelo 2 is extremely well preserved because it was underwater. But we do know, once there was domestication, those barley grains in Israel, every year, 6,000 times those grains have been grown, harvested, ground, eaten, and some planted again without stopping. You can't stop. It is a cycle. It never stops. Ground. Add water. Knead the dough. Bake the dough. Feed your family. Shit it out. Grind the grain. Make the dough. Bake the dough. Feed your family. Shit it out. For 6,000 years we know those same grains from that site in Israel. That's what happened to it. So I want you to think of this and all breads as an instantiation, as a moment, a slice in a process. But I want you to think of that process that includes Arthur Daniels Midling, the international grain trade, the insurers of ships in the Lloyd's Tower in London, the Ultramax, the Ultra Panamax tankers, these huge tankers that no longer fit through the Panama Canal, that are moving the grains as we speak, the satellites that are tracking them as we speak, the factories being built as we speak, the vehicles, the tractors, all of that is in this. And Brodell says, these big structures, they move slowly. They move so slowly, it's like time stops. It controls history. Very difficult to shift them. Very difficult to shift them. Our entire world, which developed during this Holocene period, that's now shifting to the Anthropocene. All of this developed, all of these processes developed around wheat. Just by nature of how the colonialism and the way the world ended up working, we brought this bread everywhere at the point of a sword, at the point of a gun, except in East Asia. Only China, Japan, Korea, they have adopted bread on their own for cultural reasons, social reasons, but not, it was not actually imposed on them. But every place else, after the Gerald Diamond's government is still walking east and west in Eurasia to the far western peninsula we call Europe, all the way over to East Asia, but all the other movements were violent for this grain. So, in closing, pulling this back again to Park House. In Park House, we see they had lots of good land. And if you can go to Zurich, you can see it. It's obvious. It's all flat. And then you've got the mountains, and they were on the edge of the shore, so they just had to walk upland some to have good land. And they did not grow barley on it. They just did not grow barley on it. They used barley maybe for these religious purposes, when you make something that's off. Sometimes culturally those are used in funerals. I should have said all these breads were burnt. The only way breads survive, except in Egypt, is carbonized. The Egyptian breads that are in museums, those are the actual breads. But all these were burnt. We don't know why. And these two breads were found within a few feet of each other. Now, today, and in those grains I passed out, the fact that the barley is still hulled, and that's not a hull you get off, you can see, it's fused. It's fused. Those were choices made in the Neolithic. Today, there's a very big problem everywhere wheat is grown from climate change. It doesn't like the heat, and it desperately needs more water. It's a huge problem in the Punjab. The Punjab is 1.5% of the Indian national landmass and produces 20% of the wheat. India produced 3.7 million hectares of barley in 1960. Today it only has 800,000. In the Punjab, then 166,000 hectares, which is more than twice an acre, in 1960. And thanks to the Green Revolution, which is fully aligned with the culture in Park House, all that's important is wheat. Forget about barley. All that's important is wheat. Have put all the energy in the genetic engineering, the genetic work, development into wheat. Government price support systems are only for wheat. There's now only 500 hectares of barley being grown in the Punjab. But the one great thing, barley also has a problem with heat. but it is very efficient with water. So the thing to do now, as we move into the Anthropocene, is to switch out our wheat fields in Kansas, our wheat fields in Saskatchewan, our wheat fields in Australia, where, as you know, drought is the problem, the wheat fields in the Punjab for barley. But barley is not bread. Thank you very much.
We have a microphone for questions. Thank you for your scholarship and your passion, William. Wow. Over to Charlie.
Charles.
You called for it, so I'm going to tell you about the Arabic breads. There is a word for flatbread in Arabic, and there are several different grades of particularly thin breads. You know, the thinner they are, the more admired they are. But there's a general word for bread, khubz. And in medieval Baghdad, there was a guy named Khubz al-Uzi, which means the guy who made bread from rice. So he was making some kind of a flatbread from rice. I have no idea what it would have been like. He pointed out the interesting fact that in Egypt, the word for bread, the colloquial word for bread, is aish, which is actually the literary Arabic word for life. In the Persian Gulf, aish means rice. In parts of North Africa, it means couscous, which can be made even out of things that aren't even grains. You can make couscous out of chestnut flour, things like that. It shows how dependent people are on this one particular food. You know, whatever it is, it's the source of life. Also, I'd like to point out that William Rubel wasn't the only guy who went around enslaving people. The Aztecs enslaved everybody to get their hands on. So it's a long-standing vice in the human race, and it wasn't until the late 18th century that people started thinking that slavery wasn't just an okay thing. It stank in the nostrils of God, and we have all come around to that.
Thank you, Charles.
Anybody else? Anybody else getting hungry for breads? I'll get you. Oh, come on. There you go. Sure.
Thank you for the scholarship and the passion of that talk. Just one thing I wanted to get straight for myself. That mutation where the grain wouldn't break off, was I didn't pick up on this, was the implication that then humans had to distribute it? And was that an important junction?
Yes, that's right. You can't, so first the mutation has to exist. And then humans have to somehow recognize that it exists or do something that will increase its percentage so that they can recognize that it exists. So I'm actually sort of working on that the last day or two. For me, the big problem putting this talk together is that I am using Anthropic's Claude Opus 4.5 model, which is so smart and does such brilliant research and enables me to get so deep into things that I sort of can't stop researching and learning. So yes, this existed. So in the Halo 2, 36% of the grains found show that they had been forcefully broken off the stalk rather than just flew off in the wind. And this is at the cutting edge of a dispute over how over-domestication. There's a group that argues it happens slowly by slowly over time, and then suddenly, all at once, the way you go bankrupt. And another group that says, no, this was done on purpose, with focus, all all at once in a cycle that could have been taken as few as 20 years, 20 to 200 years, could have just been like that. And so it turns out that with this grain, so there's two things that are true. One is that you've got this 1% mutation, and the one that we would be dealing with is brittle 1, BLRT, brittle, BT, anyway, whatever that is in 3 letters, 1, is that the top, just naturally, in the wind, when it ripens, the top ones are going to blow off, and the bottom ones are going to stick longer. Even though, and that doesn't mean that that plant is from a plant that has, you either have the mutation for it not to break off or you don't. But if you sit there and there are lots and lots of fields of grain, and if it's wind dispersed, then when you come there with your, and they look like shark teeth size, you can go look them up, what an epipaleolithic or Natufian size looks like. When you go like this, it shapes the plant, and the things, any ripe grains are going to go flying on the top of the plant, but not so many on the bottom of the plant. So that when they got them back to their village by the Sea of Galilee, and when they did some scratch hoeing, some replanting, again, we know the replanting, it has the weeds like darnel that are associated with agriculture. It has a higher ratio of these things broke off. But that would have had no genetic influence because they didn't keep going and then somehow noticing, but this stalk, none of them fell off. So let's be really careful about that stalk and put it aside. I once did help a Hmong woman select seeds for her maize, her corn crop. I was walking down the street, I see her just doing stuff. I sit down and join her. So, these people would have been purposefully selected. So the conflict is between this idea, it just sort of slowly evolved, and no, they would have been starting with 36% because if they harvested especially green, which is what we can see they did from the marks on the sides. But then there's be purposeful selection. And my use of Claude really is like a co-author, to be honest. Claude points out that it was a lot more work to make wheat stick, not wind dispersed than it is to do to barley, just the way the genetics work. So we really worked at it. It's another example that the genome itself tells you that significant cultural effort was put into this grain and not the barley. Does that answer your question?
Okay, is that right?
It's on.
This is a question that might be another whole lecture, but one of the fascinating things to me that you said was that a lot of the bread was burned, or charcoal, or charred, and so that kind of brings me to how did they bake it? I mean, I've seen ancient ovens, but I've also seen bread being baked in the sand, in the desert.
Okay.
So back then, how was it burned, and did that relate to, was it all burned?
Okay. So first of all, no, it was not all burned. I have ADHD, and so I'm very good at burning flatbreads in my bread oven. I'm an expert. All you have to do is start talking to me, and I forget that it's there. So one possibility is that somebody just had ADHD and forgot. I mean, I know it sounds ridiculous, but there also are these archaeological, they've really, the Swiss archaeologists, they're combing the sites. They're doing so much work on these platform villages. And they will find an axe out of place. They find objects out of place. And, you know, I interpret everything through myself. So I just say, yeah, right. The guy went out hunting, not hunting, he went out to do some forestry work with his axe. He saw some wild strawberries. He sees a storm is coming up. He gets distracted, and he walks away. I lost a very expensive pair of glasses collecting wild strawberries in Switzerland. Okay. First of all, there were bread ovens from the very beginning. Early pre-pottery Neolithic houses in Çatalhöyük, the UNESCO heritage site in Turkey. You don't need to remember the name. Just type in UNESCO heritage site, Turkey Neolithic. It's going to come up. So there were bread ovens in every house in that community. They don't report bread ovens. But let me just say, look, the problem is these archaeologists, they're not bakers, and they're not actually interested. So there is a group, they do get interested in interpreting the scanning electron microscopy. So they do experimental archaeology to the extent where they will make something, they'll burn it and see, well, okay, that's what I see. Now what do I see in this burnt carbon? But they don't really think about culture in that way. I mean, so there's still a lot of room for culinary history to deepen, especially in the past. They could have cooked them under pots. You know, what you saw in the Bedouin system. You have a fire, you heat the sand, you brush that away, you put down your flatbread, you put the ashes back on top, and you make yourself an absolutely lovely bread. Ash doesn't stick if the dough is stiff enough. So that works. You could do that and then have a pot on top. The archaeologists haven't analyzed the pots down to that level of, do I see evidence of repeated baking? But I'm going to guess they were cooked under a lid. Or the flatbread could be done the way I've seen it in Rajasthan, where you bake them on. There they set the dough on a tablet, on a griddle, terracotta griddle, and then finish it either on the embers or beside the fire, where it gets that extra heat. Those are ways it could be done. And if they were baked in the ashes, the way you saw, which is also possible, of course that all would have washed away when they were thrown into the water. It's unlikely that they were burnt for ritual purposes, because normally you eat those breads, the breads that were given to the gods in Egyptian temples or Greek temples or Sumerian temples. They were all eventually distributed for human consumption. Did that answer your question?
William, one last question. Forget nutrition, talk pleasure. What's your last piece of bread at your final meal? What would you eat?
Okay, well, that one's going to be easy, because I'm a big believer that the best bread is the bread that you make, whether it's the best bread or not. So that would really be my answer, is the last bread I baked.
Thank you very much. Charlie has something for you.